So it's great to be here with Felix Oberholzer-Gee. He is the Andreas Andresen Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He's an award-winning instructor. His academic work has touched on many strategic concepts that relate to business ecosystem-based competition. He recently wrote a book, one of my favorite books on business strategy, called Better, Simpler Strategy. And we have a great opportunity here to hear from him about how he thinks about competition when it is based on ecosystems rather than company to company. Felix, thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you, Kaihan. I'm delighted to be here.
Lovely, lovely. So for those of us who are not as familiar with the model that you use, could you just kind of briefly describe the value stick to us?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. So the basic idea is that financial performance comes from two sources, really. If you look at these dramatic differences in how well companies do, basically any two companies you look at, even if they're in the same industry, in their same country, the same point in time, you see these really large differences. And it comes from more value creation for customers, which I measure as the difference between their willingness to pay and the prices that they pay for the products and services, or more value creation for employees inside the organization, which I measure as the difference between minimum compensation, how little could you have paid and they would still have joined the organization, and then your actual salary, your actual compensation. And so think about the companies that do really well. They do really one of these two things, and often both things at one and the same time, in that they create more value for their customers, they create more value for their employees. And that leads to these differences that are really not fleeting. If you look at the data, it's not just, snapshot in time, you had a great quarter. It's really like over long periods of time. Some companies are just much better at doing this than others.
Got it. Great. So it's almost sort of like inputs, which can include employee inputs and suppliers, and then the difference between that and the value to customer. And then you're then sharing that with the customer, with the input providers, employees, and then there's some left over for you as well.
Yes, we hope that there's some left over.
Hope it is, right. Great. So I see how that applies very neatly to company to company based competition. And kind of the company or the firm has been the primary unit of measure in the study of competitive advantage. And so now we're talking about maybe we should also include the ecosystem as a unit of measure. And so my starting, first I was wondering on your thoughts on the whole premise of this series is that ecosystem-based competition is growing in its import or frequency. Do you think that's right? And if so, or if not, why?
So can I first say, without being impolite, I really don't like this term ecosystem.
Great.
And the reason why I don't like it so much is people call all kinds of things ecosystems. And when you look at how ecosystems are helpful for your performance, how they actually make a difference, the mechanisms that are behind what's called an ecosystem are radically different. So sometimes you have something like an umbrella brand. Think Marriott Hotel, that somehow there's something about Marriott being the umbrella brand for lots of different hotels. And then people say, well, that's a little bit like the ecosystem of Marriott Hotels. That's radically different from thinking about ecosystems as complements to your business. And so first advice that I might have is you really want to understand how what you call an ecosystem, how that creates value for your organization. And sometimes people think of it as a question of vertical integration. Sometimes people think of it as marketing activities that are closely related. Sometimes people use it sort of more in a corporate strategy sense, where I lend a particular expertise to a range of companies that I'm affiliated with. And so there's lots and lots of different models. The way I like to use it is I think of it mostly as driven by complements. And I much rather just say complements than ecosystems, because then at least we can have a good sense of where the competitive advantage comes from and why it might be more important now than it's been in the past.
Yes. Yeah, I think that looking at compliments, I think is really helpful, because in some of the interviews, you could tell that the frame was really not so much about compliments, but about components in the stack that are like
Yes.
embedded in the value and the core value proposition. Yeah, go
You
ahead.
know how everybody's talking about flywheels, and
Right.
everybody has like a completely different notion of what that is.
Right.
And the part that always worries me is when I worked with executive teams or when I talk with strategists, and if there's not a deep understanding where your competitive advantage comes from, it's really hard to know how to allocate resources, right? Because you're a little like, things are going well, you're profitable, and that's of course great. But unless you really understand what's driving that competitive advantage, deepening it over time and allocating capital, allocating talent to the right kinds of initiatives and projects becomes very difficult. If I may, having said this, back to your question, like have they become more important? I would say the following. There's really interesting research that looks at the age of firms. And what you see, and this has been fairly stable over time, that in early stage ventures, compliments don't typically play a big role. You don't meet very many entrepreneurs who really deeply worried about what's my ecosystem, what's the set of compliments around my business. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is you're tiny, you just started out. And so the incentives for anyone to provide compliments to your business are quite muted. And if there are important compliments, they typically sit at the level of the industry. They don't sit at the level of the individual business. So that's a first is really important distinction that I think everyone should be thinking about. So say electric vehicles and charging stations. Obviously, those are complements, but you can imagine a world in which charging stations are specific to a particular company, the way some of the Tesla chargers are, where they're not actually interchangeable. And so that becomes a competitive advantage for Tesla at the risk of slowing down the adoption of electric vehicles overall, because unless we have charging stations, we're not going to get a big fleet of electric vehicles. If the complements sit at the level of the industry, so say in the Build Back Better infrastructure plan, where we have these investments in charging stations, those charging stations presumably will use standard technology that then doesn't really matter. Am I driving a Ford? Am I driving GM? Am I driving any one of these other vehicles? They're all common. And so early on in the history of a company, you see if complements play a role at all, they're these industry level complements. And so they're really important for getting your business off the ground, but they don't provide competitive advantage because they're accessible to everyone. And then as firms age, as they get older, you can literally see with age how complements become more and more important over time, how the core of your competitive advantage is often eroded because people have figured out what you do and how you do it and how you are fabulous at one point in time. And now complementarities kick in where you shore up your competitive advantage over time. Because that's the thing that's hard to do if you're not the market leader, because you will always have reduced incentives. Like if I have a great idea for a complement and I'm looking at your business, Kion, the first thing that I will ask is like, oh, how big is your business? If your business is really tiny, I have muted incentives to provide complements. And as a result, the market leader essentially shores up its competitive position over time by creating these ecosystems, by making use of complements.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So maybe like the nature of how broad and inclusive or exclusive the ecosystem ends up being depends on who initiates the ecosystem. And if it is sort of a new ecosystem being created by a scaled provider that can already bring in suppliers and buyers, right, they can dictate more. Whereas if it is a ecosystem that's originally created by many small players, then you need a more kind of open API or
yes, that's it. That's exactly right. And the difference is driven by the eroding competitive advantage of the core of the big players. So,
Okay.
of course, the current example that everybody's talking about is Apple, is maybe the most beautiful example. And so you remember that in the early days, of course, there's nothing like an iPhone. And so you compete on the iPhone. And when you look at the margins on the software side of the business, they're tiny. In fact, the early versions of iTunes, they barely break even after credit card processing costs. And over time, other players learn how to make really great phones. And right now, it's actually astounding to me now that we saw the product introduction, the new cheaper phone. I see Apple ads that advertise the fact that they're lower priced, which we could never ever have imagined, right? That was just like, what do you mean? Like an Apple ad with a price in it? And of course, the idea is if I bring down the price of my core product, willingness to pay for the complement goes up. And that allows me to shift profit pools from my core to the complement. And so in Apple's case, you see for the longest time, all the margins come from hardware. There's hardly any margin on the software side. Now I'm having a harder time competing in hardware because guess what? Other phones are really quite amazing as well. They're often lower priced. So I'm shifting the profit pool to where I have a more defensible competitive advantage, which is the App Store, because guess what? There's only a handful of app stores, and I'm one of the really big ones. And so I'm shifting the profit pool away from hardware to software. And that is, I think, why we see these ecosystems, why we see the complements being really important at a more mature stage of the industry.
Right. Yes. Interesting. And it seems that one theme that kind of came out of the interviews was when you are serving customers with an ecosystem or through an ecosystem, then you can be more focused in the part of the value that you provide. You could just provide the app store. You could just provide the technology. You could just provide the chip. But then, as you're saying, as profit pools shift, then, you might be kind of out of luck because they're shifting away from your unique contribution.
Yes. And maybe sometimes that conversation confuses a little bit make or buy decisions from decisions how to best manage complementarities.
Okay.
Make or buy decision, do I do it myself or do I do it via someone else? Mostly has to do with to what degree do I ask the complementers to make firm-specific investments? So do I ask you to do something really extra special because I happen to be Xbox? And if the answer is no, actually, the game that you develop will live on Xbox and it will live on the PlayStation and it will live on mobile phones and it will live on PCs. If there's not great asset specificity between the complementers and the core provider of the product, then of course it's much better to have someone else who has maybe better capabilities, someone else who bears part of the risk, and you get these mixed modalities. So Microsoft now, I think by it's a little hard to keep track, but by my last count, I think they own 23 game studios now, something like this. So there's a lot of in-house production. And of course, if you look at the totality of games, like everything that I could get from Game Pass, there are lots and lots of products that get developed for Microsoft as well. And so you can have both of these modalities at one and the same point in time. And what's really asset specificity is sort of driving you a little bit in one direction or the other. But that is different, I think, from managing the aspect of the relationship that has to do with you are my complementer. There, I would say the main management task, which interestingly turns out to be actually quite emotional, is that, of course, I love the fact that someone who provides a complement that we're jointly creating value, right? So I have the Xbox and, just it's amazing that all of these people come out with these really creative ways of having us waste our time on games more than we ever thought was possible. So that's really fantastic. And then, of course, I hate the fact that I have to share that value with you. You see And so the profit pool at Apple shifts from hardware to software. What's the next thing that happens? The lawsuit, the legal battle with Epic. And that is just about, we both recognize Epic Games could never be that successful if it hadn't been for the App Store, and if it hadn't been for Apple, and people love gaming on their mobile devices. But at the same time, now that we're down to how do we share the spoils of what we created? That is the key managerial tension. So I don't think of it so much as it's sort of a make or buy kind of relationship. What's really hard emotionally is, on the one hand, we're working together and we couldn't really be successful without one another. And on the other hand, I just don't really want to share 30% of my revenue with you. And that, I think, creates the tension.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. That has come up several times. Ben Gomez Caceres at Brandeis, he has these 3 rules of, he doesn't call them ecosystems, he calls them constellations.
Okay.
But he said that, you know, there's 2 different terms. He did his work before ecosystem as a term was popular.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
And he one rule is 1 + 1 = 3. So us working together, all, you know, we need to create value together.
Yeah.
The other one is 1 + 1 = 1, which means we need to be able to coordinate and act as one. And you need a mechanism to allow for the parts to come together and provide value to the end user. But the other one, he calls it 1 + 1 = 1.4 + 1.6, or 1.3 + 1.7. And so that speaks to the dividing of the shared value. And that, yeah, and so I think that's what you're saying as well, that there is sort of a fairness test. We're always thinking, am I getting a fair share of the value that I'm contributing?
Yeah. So I would say there are sort of 2 tasks for the person who manages the relationship with the complementer. The first one is to understand, where does the tension come from? And sharing the value is just one sort of tension. Actually, the tensions exist at very many different levels. If you think back to the classic personal computer era, where you have Microsoft and Intel collaborating, why is there tension there? Well, Intel makes money when they come up with the next generation chips and when you buy a new personal computer. Microsoft makes money both when you upgrade to the next version of its operating system, but also they're making money off of the installed base, because you're upgrading your software and that's a source of revenue. So when now Intel and Microsoft talk about how quickly do you want to come out with the next version of Office, with the next version of the operating system, with the next generation of chips, Intel's incentive is always, oh, let's do it as quickly as possible because we want people to get a good reason to buy their next machine. And Microsoft will say, well, not so fast, because we have a lot of revenue from the installed base. And so the pressures on our business to always come out with the next generation of our operating system is much reduced. So that's an example where it's not just about value creation. It's the tension sits at the heart of how quickly do you want innovation to progress in your industry. And I would say that's maybe task number 1, is really understand the economics and the strategy of your complementer. What's their business model? How do they create success? And then how closely connected is that to how you create success? I would say to the constellation, the 1 + 1 is 2. You're not going to get perfect alignment, because just like the products are different, than the incentives. I think the Intel Microsoft story is a good story to illustrate that. And then the second thing is, I think, much more emotional, and you see it all the time. So actually, the Microsoft story is like a funny story. So Bill Gates and Andy Grove, CEOs of Microsoft and Intel, they meet for a dinner to talk about these issues and these tensions. And the dinner doesn't go well. And then, even though, such a big part of their performance depends on this coordination between the two leaders. For years, they don't talk. Or if you see the relationship now between the CEOs of Apple and Epic Games, where you can literally feel like how they just really dislike each other, and at a very personal, very emotional level. And that, I think, is sort of the second part of managing these relationships with complementers, that you understand, yes, we're not going to see eye to eye. For sure, we're not going to see eye to eye. Maybe it's just a simple case of how do we divide up the pie. Maybe it's much more complicated because our underlying incentives are different. But it's not. Don't let it be personal. Don't let it get to you in the sense that, oh, now we're actually. I mean, think about the Epic one. What does it mean for two companies to end up in court? That always means we miserably failed at coordination. This never, like, if we're savvy business people, we will never end up in court. And so there's some miscalculation on either side here. And so much of it I see is in the emotions when people talk about their complementers, where it's this love-hate relationship.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know where it came from, but what also has come out is the idea of the importance of the personal relationships, and many of the practitioners, talked about that. And I guess that does make sense that where it comes from. Now, what happens then? What is the? I'm sorry. I'm thinking out loud. You're having me think about things that we haven't thought about yet. But let's say Microsoft now buys Activision, and now the relationship there is different, right? We don't have to we negotiate differently when Activision's now owned by Microsoft. So there's some kind of internal mechanism when ownership is shared that obfuscates or aligns interests, but there's still going to be tension between them, right? There's going to be one business unit that's saying, hey, we're producing a lot of value for the company and you're not reinvesting as much in us, so we should get a greater reinvestment. But I guess they have some kind of internal mechanism. Right?
Yeah. So it's a fantastic question. So think about one of many reasons, but maybe the most important reason for Microsoft to buy Activision was to really establish Game Pass as the main vehicle for you to have access to games. And so we're having all of these studios, and their job is basically to create the kinds of games that would make people love Game Pass. And say that's more likely the case if you have an outstanding hit. Now, you have some of the studios that think, well, actually, our capabilities are not really that. Like, our capabilities are more like fast follower. We can see what's trendy, we can see what's new, and then we sort of, do an interesting twist on what exists already. That might not be great for Game Pass, because how many twists on the ever same games do I really need? So that's the kind of tension that you want to think about. And those are the kinds of tensions that actually don't go away with ownership. Maybe the most dramatic example that I can think of is when Disney buys Pixar. Right? So now you have vertical integration. And of course, the idea is, the characters that Pixar comes up with, they're going to feed the rest of the Disney ecosystem. And you're keeping the two companies as far apart as you possibly can, because really Lasseter is the only one that sort of goes back and forth between the two entities. You're keeping them away because you're very worried about the Disney culture not being so compatible with the Pixar culture. And if talent at Pixar leaves, what you will have a set of really expensive computers and not much more. So you're deciding, okay, we leave them separate. And then I don't know if you remember, like the very first movie that they come up with is Up. Like, remember, it's like this old man and the balloon.
Yeah, with the balloon, right?
That's like an amazing movie. And what exactly is the T-shirt that I'm going to buy? And what's the theme ride? And what's the toy? And there's nothing, right? It's an amazing movie, but it doesn't really feed the Disney ecosystem and the cruise ships and the hotels and everything else. So think about Inside Out. It's like that movie about memory, how memory works. I just love that movie.
Yeah,
I mean, it's an amazing movie. What does it do for the rest of Disney's quote unquote ecosystem? Nothing. Like,
mm,
what's the theme ride? What's the T-shirt? What's the game? And so on and so on. So don't
mm,
think by bringing these complementers in house, you can completely do away with the tensions. That's like a very similar tension that you then put a little pressure on Pixar to actually come up. Toy Story. I forget where we are, 3, 4, 5. That would be like really great for the ecosystem because we know that's what people really love. So that
yes.
it's a little bit having to do with, when companies vertically integrate, like the most common reason for that, they will say is, oh, I get so much more control. And then you ask people inside your organization, like, what's the hardest thing to do? And they will tell you, oh, alignment is really hard because I don't really have control over everyone. Well,
Mhm.
which is it? Like, do you have control or do you not have control?
Right, right.
We always overestimate.
I guess at least you have captivity because, that supplier, that contributor to the ecosystem always has other ecosystems that they could develop for a different game platform, but you could lock them in and kind of raise the switching cost or to.
Yes, I think that's sometimes a big advantage. And then, of course, less so where the productivity of the complementer depends on the talent that they have.
Mm. Oh,
Right?
right.
So the fear is like, say, say we, and obviously this is now a live conversation around Disney and the portrayal of gay characters in their movies.
Mm.
If you then push very hard, of course you own the company, but talent is free to leave. And if talent leaves, the company that you bought is probably not that valuable.
Fascinating. Yes, because you're operating in a talent ecosystem as well. I mean,
That's right.
talent
Yes.
talent can always choose.
Yep.
Fascinating. Yeah, I interviewed Richard Rummelt last week,
Oh,
and I
okay.
asked him
Yep.
a question about vertical integration and when do you do it? And he said, so I don't. There's no. I don't know if there's a question here, but I'd love to see if you have a response or anything. He said he was kind of thought about it. He said it seems vertical integration makes. I think you tend to see it when you need to create a leap in performance or innovation. So, for example, Tesla being vertically integrated, you need to. We're looking to advance, automotive the industry. You can't rely on each little contributor to make a big leap. So you need to kind of control them, I guess.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then when the leap has happened, then you might see the industry then fragment again into non-vertically integrated specialist players.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Dick is exactly right, and maybe just like saying it a little differently is,
Sure.
if I ask one of my suppliers to make very specific investments that only make sense in my relationship with them, then of course that's really nerve-wracking. Like, why would I do that? Because in the case of a startup, I'm not even really sure that you're going to be all that successful. So definitely, like early on in the history of Tesla, do I want to make any investments that are specific for Tesla? Probably not, because I don't really know, are you a big hit or are you not a big hit? And then I think in more mature relationships, you often see it's a version of worrying about, I can make a specific investment, but I have no idea, can I actually reap the benefits of that investment? So
Mhm.
digital cinema is like a great example. We had the technology for digital cinema forever, like a very long time ago. But
Mhm.
you, as an individual owner of a movie theater, do you really want to invest? Well, on the one hand, you want, because you know it's going to increase willingness to pay of your audience because digital cinema is really a better experience. But then isn't just the movie industry is going to jack up the prices for movies, and you
Mhm.
cannot really hold on. And so both of these arguments, like how specific are the investments of the complementers or anyone in the vertical chain really, and how do they think about the bargaining situation, like who gets what fraction of the spoils? I
Yes.
think those are both reasons why you then see integrated models. And often at this point in time, you see a little bit of both, like in the gaming space, where some of it is integrated and some of it is left to the rest of the
Yes.
market.
Excellent. Yes. So yeah, then it comes back down to um, seed bargaining position, at least on how the spoils are divided. Um, I was kind of thinking about the if I took the value stick model. I guess I was thinking, how do you think about applying that if we step out and look at an ecosystem? Because I was kind of thinking that at the propensity to sell, there are a bunch of partners. Then going up the value, there are probably a whole bunch of like value sticks from one to the other. And then at the very top, there are the end users, ultimate end users of whatever the value is of the ecosystem. But you probably have different paths. In some case, you have a kind of, you're supplying to me and then I'm adding value and then I'm distributing directly. But then there are ways for people to buy the complement directly rather than bundled in. So if you were to think about a model for an ecosystem, how would you translate the value stick?
Yeah. So I would first say to identify the set of complements, that is always super easy in hindsight, right? I just know like which technology, which product, which everything, which one was a substitute, which one was a complement is like so clear to us. But in the moment, it's actually really hard to know. So the first question you want to be a little careful about is like our ability to really identify complements in a reliable way is like, yeah.
You have some good examples of that, I think, like in music, where we thought something wasn't going to be a compliment, but then it turned out to be a compliment. Could you give us one example just so that people are following you?
Yes, yeah. So lots of examples. So of course, when digital music first comes along, we think, oh my God, this is going to be terrible. And now it turns out that as a result of the impact on the willingness to pay for concerts, for instance, part of the music ecosystem have become much more valuable as a result of the existence of complementarity. Maybe the most dramatic example, when PCs first came along, of course, everybody thinks that's the end of the paper industry. Because now, everything's digital. Why would you print anything? And then it turns out, oh God, we love printing. So paper demand in the US essentially doubles as a result of the PC. And now it turns out, I think it's sort of, we see the downturn, but it took basically 30, 40 years for the substitutability to kick in. So our ability to recognize the complements is not that great. And then you just want to do the test. Okay, if this thing gets cheaper, does willingness to pay for my product increase or does it decrease? If willingness to pay increases, then it's a complement. If the complement gets cheaper and willingness to sell on the employee side falls, it's a complement on the supply side. And so that's the first thing you want to think about. And it's really, is blockchain a complement or a substitute for current financial services? I don't really know. I can tell both stories, and there's like good arguments on both sides. So I think that's like the first thing I would say. And then one of the beautiful things about the value-based strategy model is that in the end, you don't really care about where exactly in a vertical chain a complement is offered. Could be that it's somewhere in the middle. It could be that it's maybe the person who has the B2C relationship, because the power of the complement is that it increases willingness to pay. And then it all becomes a question is, okay, so we created just more value because we have an increase in willingness to pay. And now how does it get divided up? And that is all a question of, are you differentiated from other players in the value chain? So interestingly, who exactly provides the complement is a question you can be quite relaxed about, because all it means is the total value pool in the industry is going to increase. And then the question of who gets to capture how much of that value pool is back to the usual, are you differentiated relative to everyone else in that industry?
Right. Yeah, it makes sense, which is why in Ron Adler's book on the topic, he lays out an example of Amazon Alexa. And so, he kind of described this sequencing where if, first you start and you get a few compliments, and then your bargaining power increases, and then you get more compliments, and then you get more people developing to do tasks on Alexa. But there's kind of like the sequencing where you probably like are growing your bargaining power as you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So that's the classic chicken and egg problem, right? That
Right.
if I don't really have many apps on Alexa, Alexa's not that great. If Alexa doesn't find widespread adoption, then my incentives to produce an app are really reduced. So this is why in the beginning you often see when I want to get an indirect network effect, if I want to get it started. So it's not just, that's maybe a distinction we haven't really spoken about. So there's just the existence of a complement which helps drive willingness to pay. But the number of users that you have for that complement doesn't really matter. So that's sort of the base case. Think like razor blade, printer cartridges kinds of business models. Now, if it's not just a complement, but if there's an indirect network effect in the sense that the more users I have, the greater the incentive to actually produce complements, that then creates this chicken and egg problem. And that's actually contrary to what I said at the very beginning, that you typically don't really see ecosystems play a big role for really young firms. There is the young firm cannot really exist unless it builds an indirect network. And since that is hard to do, these indirect network effects then tend to sit at the level of the industry, which is great to get the industry off the ground, but not so great from a profitability point of view.
Do you think if you were to advise a company that is, has primarily been directly delivering, they're probably complements, but they haven't coordinated them. They just sort of like make something and sell it. And then they start looking at increasing their, embracing an ecosystem approach. Maybe that's indirect sales. Maybe that's coordinating more professionally with complements or whatever that is. And they're how does their thinking of strategy, what needs to change?
So the first thing I'll say is the part that doesn't change is that everything needs to be read through the lens of customer willingness to pay or employee willingness to sell, right? That's even like figuring out which complements are important, which complements are not important. The yardstick, the lens that you use is always the lens of, does it increase willingness to pay of the customers I currently serve? If that's not the case, it's not, it might be an interesting product. It might be an interesting opportunity for someone else. It's not a business that you should be in. And then figuring out what are the capabilities that you need to succeed in the space for complements. Are these capabilities that you currently have in-house, in which case, in particular, if they're indirect network effects, you might be able to spurn those developments. Are these capabilities that are very different, and so it's probably makes more sense to collaborate with complementers. And then, as always, as you think about the relationship with the complementers, because if the price for the complement falls, willingness to pay for your product goes up, you like competition in the industry, right? You like that there's lots and lots of people who produce games. That can only be good for the gaming, for the entity that produces the gaming console. And that, of course, lives at a tension with what are the incentives of those complementers to really invest in something that is going to increase willingness to pay of your customer. And I would say thinking about that trade-off is maybe the most important thing to do. You want to give complementers, high-quality complementers with differentiated capabilities. You want to give them enough incentives to produce for whatever you need as a complement. And at the same time, you don't want them to be all that powerful, because if they get really, really powerful, then you actually have a relationship that may have looked interesting at the very beginning, and now, unfortunately, turns out to be a bit of a nightmare. So Restaurant reservation systems are a great example for that, right? So that's a great complement to have, obviously easier for customers to reserve. And in the beginning, they come to restaurants and to say, how would you like to have more customers? And of course, no one says, oh, I don't want more customers. You say, that's like a fantastic. And what do you mean? You're also giving me like a little panel that I could use to see the reservations, and everything is just fantastic. And then over time, as OpenTable becomes the one destination to go to and create restaurant reservations, they take a larger and larger share of the value that you jointly create. And it's actually very interesting. Once OpenTable became dominant, we had all of these other entrants, mostly from the restaurant side. So, we had Resi, we had all of these all of these entrants that came in, and you just see so difficult to get traction. Why? Well, this is actually now an indirect network effect where if I'm not on OpenTable, my restaurant just doesn't exist. And so whatever you get is like the restaurants that break away are the really famous restaurants because, they don't rely on visibility on OpenTable, but everyone else is basically stuck. And then it took the investment of American Express that now is quite successful at pushing Resi. Why does that work? Well, Resi is a complement to the American Express business that actually has nothing to do with competition in the industry space. So two things to remember. You want the space of complements to remain competitive so that you don't fall into that trap of having a dominant complementer to work with. At the same time, if you miss the moment, if you thought, okay, so, now we're stuck and there is this really powerful OpenTable, your best chance is probably to look for other big players who then look at a complementer like Resi and say, actually, that's a complement to a business, but we're not really competing with restaurants directly. And so you encourage entry. If you don't have that, encouraging entry against a dominant player that benefits from indirect network effects is just a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and there's some element of the switching costs. I think, a restaurant is integrated in, I think, with OpenTable because they use OpenTable for other management of it's like a restaurant. Whereas Lyft might just have just switch to Uber, with another phone, or they don't. The switching costs are very low, and
yeah. So maybe that's an interesting thing to think about. One argument that people often make about ecosystems, whatever that might mean in that context, is that, we're going to have switching costs. And when you have switching costs, then the expectation is that my business is going to be much more profitable. So what's fascinating about this argument is if you look for examples, you see many industries with significant switching costs where profits are high. And you see many industries with significant switching costs where profits are low. You ask, I thought switching costs always are good for the industry. And the answer is no. Of course, two things happen. The customers that are captive, for them, you can raise prices, you can be more profitable. And because they're captive, they can't really go anywhere. But for customers that you look to acquire, because the lifetime value of customers that will experience high switching costs, that lifetime value of customer is much higher. And so we're competing like there's no tomorrow so customer acquisition costs tend to be sky high in arenas with high switching costs. And really what you're doing as a strategy is you're trading off these two kinds of things. If you're thinking about, should I raise my switching costs, be very careful, because what's going to happen is customer acquisition costs will go up because everybody will really fight for these new customers. And obviously the installed base or the stock of customers that you have is going to be more profitable. The net effect is anyone's guess in many situations.
Right. Yeah. And I guess it depends on the competitiveness of the alternative ecosystem.
And how mature the market is. Is there significant growth so that customer acquisition costs are really that important? Or is anyone is if the moment everyone is captive to some ecosystem, of course, the argument about customer acquisition cost is not that high.
Yes, suddenly you have to buy them. Got it. Okay, wow, this is great. We're reaching the top of our time with you. Lots of other openings and questions to explore. But given the time we have, is there anything that you want to leave us with? Anything you didn't get to say or advice you have?
I think it was a pretty grand tour through the nature of ecosystems. So the point that I made at the very beginning is maybe the one that stands out to me the most. Be just really, when you use all the business jargon, when you say flywheel, when you say ecosystem, all these terms that are flying around, totally okay to use them. But of course, always have at least a very precise model in mind, how whatever it is that you're talking about, how it increases willingness to pay or decreases willingness to sell. Because in the end, those are the only two strategic levers you have. That's where really profitability comes from. And if you're vague about that relationship, or if you're, it's sort of a shorthand for many things, I'm just really worried about how you will make capital and talent allocation decisions.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Felix.